business as usual. I mean, they drew no attention to it, and they didn't seem to derive any pleasure whatsoever from it.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
And as a kid, it really, really upset me, and a lot of times we wouldn't watch, or we would kind of be shooed back in the house. But I did know that it was, to them, it was a function. It was something that needed to be done, but in no way they acted like they'd accomplished anything. Or they weren't high-fiving each other.
Right.
But they hung the... Do you want me to get really graphic?
Yeah. Well, I've seen photos. Like, of course, I've never experienced a hog killing, but I've seen photos and read about it. So I'm kind of aware of how it was done, but go ahead and
they would
tell our listeners.
Back the tractor up
Okay.
to wherever the hog fell, and they would hook his hooves, his back hooves, up to this gadget that they had, of course, that they had probably designed.
Like some kind of pulley almost?
Yes, and then they would lift it up.
Yeah.
And then they would drive it down to that lower barn, which was the tobacco barn, but on just down a little ways. They would drive it down on the tractor, and it'd be hanging, basically upside down. And at that point, they would cut its jugular.
Yeah.
In a ditch, and then it would bleed out.
Which was like a long process, right?
Yeah,
I mean, and I've heard, because there's that old phrase you hear, bleeding like a stuck pig.
Yes. It was a process.
Because that's the thing I've always heard is how much blood there is, and that it was just like horrific because there was just gallons.
And you think about how big a butchering hog is. There's a lot of blood. Yeah. And so at that point, then they would they had like wooden pallets.
Okay.
But they had like blocks and rocks and bricks. I mean, they had this nice little, designed structure, and they would take the tractor because the hog was so heavy, but they would lay it out on that. And then they had these big barrels of boiling water, like 50-gallon barrels, sitting on top of a fire pit.
Okay.
And they would be boiling. And then they would take, like little pots and scoop the boiling water out and pour it on the hog, pour it on the hog, pour it on the hog. Do that many, many, many times. Mm-hmm. And then they had some little tools and also just good sharp knives. And they would scrape and scrape and scrape and scrape the hog to get the fur. Mm-hmm. To get the hide, the skin, the fur, hair, whatever, off. And then that was what took so long. And my grandmother was an extremely clean woman. I mean, you didn't
like
dare
meticulous,
leave. Oh, yes. So that is what took forever. Because not only did they scrape it, they would soften it. Because I don't know if you've ever touched a hog, petted a hog. That fur is like very bristly and thick. Yeah, one hair strand is just really like wire. But, they pour the boiling water on it and do. And then when they got that done, then they would start cutting, and taking out the...
Like butchering.
They'd start disemboweling it. And then at that point, they'd, when they took everything out, the innards, and... took that away, then they would actually start butchering it. But they would butcher it in large pieces. And then that went into this big can house my grandmother had. Now, all this was happening outside. But they would carry the big, like the whole hip, shank, leg. Mm-hmm. They'd carry that whole thing into the can house, which was really, really big. And it was like where she did her canning and her working. And so they would take it in there and then proceed to cut it into smaller portions, like a ham, bacon, roasts.
And they had a smokehouse, too,
and everybody kind of had a job. Like somebody would be salting the hams and putting them in one area, and then they had a smokehouse, and then somebody would be making sausage, and then somebody else would be stirring a huge pot of, I guess it's fat. And they would just stir that and stir that and stir that. And I can just remember as kids, like we would be just ran completely out of that area. Because evidently if it were to ever, get on you. But it was the fat and that just rendering it. And boiling and just. But anyway, and that they would boil and boil and boil that and render that fat and turn it into oil. Like cooking oil. Yeah. And then what they'd scoop off the top with like a wire kind of colander thing, strainer. They'd scoop off the top, and they called it cracklings.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
And you'd almost like eat it like little potato chips.
Kind of like pork rinds or something.
Very, very, very much like pork rinds.
Because I've heard people talk about cracklings.
Very much like pork rinds, yes.
And so that was like the treat?
Well, I don't think they kept them. If they kept them, I don't remember it. I
was
just
just
remember
something
that
you ate, like,
you ate
in
it
the
right
moment.
then, in the moment.
Gotcha.
And
so what would have, like, your job have been during that time? Did you have a job?
well, like, I'm going to say from like maybe 6 under. No, not really. I mean, we watched, and as we were watching, people would be talking through it. You know, you cut this, you cut that. So we were, even though we didn't have a job, we basically were
Told,
we
like,
were studying.
Yeah.
Yes. And then later, I'm just taking a wild guess at maybe like 7-ish, that age. It was carry this, put that
Okay.
over there, you know, kind of like an assistant kind of measure. And then let's just say maybe when I was like 9 or 10, I do remember like helping with the sausage, stirring things,
Okay.
making like little sausage patties or pouring in seasonings, something like that.
Yeah.
And I can remember carrying hams out to the smokehouse and putting bunches and lots of salt on them. And that fascinated me to think, does that not spoil
I
that
know,
meat?
right? That's
But
really
it didn't.
fascinating.
It didn't.
And so where was that stuff all stored away?
Like the different things?
Yeah,
or-
I mean, like deep freezer
she
and
had a lot of
smokehouse
she
and all
had
that.
lots of deep freezers, and I know she didn't when her children were small. You know, they had spring
Well,
house.
right, yeah.
That's where they kept things refrigerated.
And to explain to people what a spring house is, because I may not know.
It's a spring, you know, bubbles up out of the ground,
Right.
water, and it's very, very cold, and you try to tap into the strongest source of the spring, and then they would build a little house around it. Not really a house, just a little structure.
Right.
And hopefully there were rocks close by, but if not, I guess they used animals to move rocks in. And they would build the rocks much like stair steps.
Yeah.
And then they would build this little, you know, structure around it, and they would go inside there, and like the things they wanted to be kept the coldest, they could put right down in the water. Because the way they put the rocks around it made like a little reservoir.
Okay.
And then the water continued to run down down one rock, trickle down onto another rock. So I think you would use the rocks in terms of how, or in the order of how cold you wanted to keep something.
Okay.
But the water was the only source of the cold temperature. And then the rocks would be cold because of the water.
That's so fascinating.
But my great-grandparents, their spring house was just a work of art. It literally looked like, you know, somebody had stacked up about 4 or 5 square rocks, and it just literally looked like a beautiful set of steps.
And that was at the old place? Mm-hmm. I mean, because I remember going over there and Nana pointing out this was the spring house. And
that's where
Yeah.
they kept butter, eggs. They would keep the eggs on their counter for about a day or so, but then they would put them in the cooler. And butter, milk, you know, buttermilk, whatever needed to be kept refrigerated went in the spring house. But like when I was a kid, my grandmother had a lot of freezers. She had probably 3 or 4 big deep freezers. And then they had the smokehouse. And then she had a can house, and she would can a lot of that pork. You know, preserve it in mason jars.
Wow.
And then she would put some in the freezer. And then they would cut up like bacon and just different ways. She had different ways of preserving things.
It's so interesting.
And some things were sort of dehydrated in a fashion.
What
somewhat.
does canned pork taste like? I mean, is it good? Because I don't know why.
It is.
I don't
It
know
is
why. It
good.
kind of grosses me out a little bit.
Well, I've seen canned pork that I felt like was just full of fat.
Yeah.
And I didn't really, you know, wasn't. But my grandmother, like I said, she just had a different way of doing things. It was very, very good.
Okay.
Just imagine a really good pork roast.
Yeah.
Boston butt. When you're taking a fork and you're tearing it apart to make like a pork sandwich.
Okay.
You know, you pull it apart,
Yeah.
pork. But imagine that before you've put the barbecue sauce on it.
Okay.
That's what it tastes like.
All right.
Very moist.
Interesting.
I guess she would just put like literally a big, like a slab or a piece of a roast or whatever would fit in a quart jar. She'd put
Okay.
that in there and can it, you know, apply heat so that the seal or the seal would seal and
Right.
then put the ring on it. So it was just a way to preserve it because you think they didn't have
Well, yeah.
years and years ago the refrigeration and what we have to preserve things.
Pretty interesting. Well, Mom, thank you so much for
yeah.
sharing some of your stories with us. I think this stuff is really cool to learn about. And thanks for being a guest.
You bet. I enjoyed it.
Yay, everybody give my mom a round of applause. Yay. Okay.
Give myself one.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll be back here
Hope you enjoyed
pretty soon with another episode of Mountain Murders, and we'll get back to the true crime.